experience while reading through and considering the content in this book. We're fresh off of midterm week, and today, session 16, actually marks the halfway point. Congratulations, you should be feeling good about yourselves as you've made it halfway through the class successfully. Not a lot of tears, not a lot of heartache so far. Few bumps in the night with the quizzes, which we're ironing out. But other than that, we're doing relatively well. Okay, let's get on to today's content. I'm going to share screen, and you'll probably see me drop out of the video as well. But don't worry, my voice should still be here. Just 25 minutes because it's a bit of a shorter chapter than what I've been assigning as of late. Then, of course, we'll talk about the weekly discussion question, and I'll give you 10 minutes of today's class time to sort of think about that topic question and consider what you might want to do in terms of writing an effective response to that this week. It's kind of got a long build-up because it's based on the real college experience portion of this week's chapter, chapter 6. Then just remember that for next time, which will be Wednesday when I upload another one of these videos, or, relatively speaking, it could be Tuesday night, but you probably will see it on Wednesday morning. I'm just going to have you continue with your reading regimen, moving on to chapter 7. Just what do you believe anyway? Kind of a strange chapter. That's why I've sort of packaged 6 and 7 together. But you can find the information in the text, College Success Strategies, on pages 73 and extending over to page 81. Okay. In terms of the midterm exam, I think that everybody did relatively well on this. And I did want to clarify that initially I had made some statements, especially in one of the videos. There was only going to be one attempt. And I thought, since it's a midterm quiz, why break the traditional pattern that I've been building up to so far? So I did some backpedaling on that. you may still take the quiz if you weren't satisfied with your midterm efforts, but I would pay special attention to this quiz because it does still represent like 24% of your overall grade. So it's a more substantive quiz perhaps than the first three have been, and perhaps more substantive than the remaining, what, 4 quizzes that will structure throughout the rest of the semester from now until the end of November. I thought, like I said, most of you did relatively well. It was a more limited quiz in terms of its scope. It was not cumulative. You may find in the future that when you take college level courses, your midterm exams will be cumulative, meaning that they will emphasize material that you learned from the beginning of the semester all the way up to the midterm point. That's actually fairly typical. But since this is a college career success skills class, and I really want you to be successful throughout your entirety of your college experience, I feel like perhaps drawing back on the difficulty a little bit for a course like this one, which I know is 1, mandatory, and 2, maybe not everybody's cup of tea in terms of a required course. It just makes a certain amount of sense. So again, you can take that quiz multiple times, but it will record your best effort at completing this particular quiz. So that's in your best interest. If you have not yet taken the midterm exam or the midterm quiz, you should probably do that as soon as possible. And I've also had some questions from students that I have to admit I am less than proficient at answering. So if you want to, in this week's discussion board, if anybody wants to address this question in addition to the weekly discussion topic, that would be welcome. But I had a couple of students, more than a couple actually, ask me about how to access the results of their initial quiz. And I've told you this before, but I just wanted to reiterate, I actually cannot see the same screens that you see as an instructor. Even when I use my student mode version, I can't see all of the results of the quiz. I also can't take the quiz. So a couple of students were asking how to see the results of their initial quiz. And I guided them to the best of my knowledge, but that actually did not get them to what they wanted. So if you are fairly articulate, or if you feel that you could just help out your fellow students, you may want to go ahead and just add a little component into your discussion questions, explaining how it is that you access the previous exams that you've seen and how you get a chance to look at the feedback that Mr. Fowler pipes in through the automatic response. Because if students can see that, I think they'd feel more confident about retaking various quizzes to get the best potential possible score. And like I said, that's by design. This is a mandatory class. It's assigned to everybody, regardless of your major. And it's a class that's actually designed to give you accessible information to help you throughout your entire college career. So there's no real big sense of victory if I catch you not paying attention, because it's ultimately all for you. So if it seems a little bit loose, perhaps that's by design. That might not be your preference. But as we're going to see in today's session, not every college class is going to be an idealized experience. Lastly, your grades. We have reached the midterm. Technically today, class session 16 is the official midway point. So as such, you may want to go ahead and check in on your midterm grade evaluations. You can again find those evaluations vis-a-vis the links on the top of Desire to Learn marked grades. You may need to expand that list of topics on your personal laptop or PC in order to see the actual grade link. There's a drop-down box or button that says more, and sometimes you'll need to adjust to display that. If you've got other questions about the grades after you check in on them, don't hesitate to contact me as always. Okay, on to today's lecture, Academic Energy. Motivation for learning, attitudes, and interests. This is again College Success Strategies, Chapter 6. Let's start by reflecting on the study questions that this chapter preps for us. After today's lecture, you should be able to answer the following questions for yourself. What motivates people to learn? How do you get and stay motivated? How do attitudes and interests influence learning? Can you change your attitude and develop interest for topics you dislike? And how can you maintain a positive attitude? So we'll answer those questions as we progress through today's lecture. And we're going to start with a trip to Motivation Island. Go ahead and take this little visual in for just a few moments. And you can see that the key tenets of Motivation Island revolve around finding information that is useful, tasks that are doable, thinking about a subject in the ways it inspires your interest and enthusiasm, finding a classroom environment that's convivial or encouraging for you to work in. So all of these various things, subject, your aspirations, the way in which you learn, the strategies you bring with you, and the classroom environment all influence your motivation. Now, you have more choice about the subjects you're learning than you might suspect. You have choice in determining what classes you take each semester. And in a traditional semester, you might even have the options to think about when or at what point of the day you want to schedule a particular class. You might want to think about how to balance your class schedule and how to find subjects that are both appealing and feature a speaker or instructor that you know has a good reputation. The other thing that influences your motivation harkens all the way back to Chapter 2, a student's desire to learn. No one can really change or modify your personal desire to learn. Therefore, it kind of has to come from within you. And that's what's tricky about Chapter 6 and its companion, Chapter 7. I wanted to front load the most important chapters before the turn of the semester. This is often a traditional time cited by students as when, the class turns. Perhaps your motivation wanes because there are so many more other things going on. We're quickly approaching the holidays, and it's a tense time for those of you who have to work outside of the college environment, especially if you work retail, or if you're the parent of a young person who's probably bubbling with excitement about Halloween and Thanksgiving and all of the other fun approaching holidays. So obviously you have to think about this idea of motivation and next week's idea about attitudes and beliefs as being something that, comes with a bit of a grain of salt. Comes with a bit of a grain? Let's just say it comes with a grain of salt. You might not believe or find these next two chapters to be that interesting, to be honest with you. You might not even feel that they're particularly helpful. Maybe this is all information that you think is basic. But I would encourage you to just Think for a minute about how this might help your fellow classmates, or how this might help somebody else that you know that struggles academically. These chapters won't be for everybody, but I've tried to do my best to distill the most essential information. Okay, that's enough of the Mr. Fowler soapbox. Let's get back to what influences motivation. We've already talked a little bit about the choices that you have in engineering the subjects that you want to learn about, and your drive or personal desire to learn. Another element is kind of in tandem with what I was just talking about, how much value the subject has for you. There are lots of students every semester, and I remember a student in particular I'll tell you about in a moment, who value some subjects over another. I remember that this particular student was not eager to return to his studies from high school Spanish. He was a little bit, concerned that the fact that he only had taken the bare requirements in high school would land him in a Spanish classroom where he was kind of over his head. And to be fair, he took every Spanish class that he had to take in order to pass his class without a lot of intrinsic information or motivation regarding the subject. Now, years later, he would find that once he had matured and adapted to the situation, but there was a lot to be interested in. There was a lot more to be considered when studying something as complicated as a foreign language. And in case if you didn't already guess, which I'm sure not many of you already did, his name was me. Yeah, that's a story from my own experience. I didn't really get into or value learning Spanish that much. But as I said, having matured and learning a little bit more about the world and sort of the history of the Spanish language and the history of Spain, it has become a little bit more interesting to me. So part of what may influence your motivation to be a successful student is the value that you place on the subject in question. Lastly, the personal control that you execute. Let's try that again. The extent to which you are willing to take personal control of your learning is, I think, a little bit more valuable than a lot of people expect. There's always a potential to blame somebody for a failure or for a struggle. I had a bad teacher. I couldn't connect to that content. I'm always been a little bit better at English than math anyway. Well, yeah, that's all may be true, but you have personal control. You have the ability to take charge of your learning process and find ways to motivate yourself and approach each class with a positive attitude. All right, so what really motivates people then? Motivation really isn't something that's done to you. Only you have the ability to motivate yourself, truthfully. So if you're already lucky enough to be a curious and engaged student, and you feel either a certain amount of intrinsic or internal pressure to do well, or just a desire to open your mind to all of the things this world has to offer, you probably don't need a lot of extra motivation. And you're probably always like that, and high school may have been a breeze for you. But even the best of us probably stumble over some subjects that we just don't, gravitate to. All right. Clearly, it would help to have some interesting instructors. If you had the I don't know, the faculty of Hogwarts or something like that available to you, maybe that would be a little bit better than, we lowly muggles who struggle at Kishwaukee College. But ultimately, it rests with you to move beyond the mere stimuli of a good grade. And that leads to the two types of motivation I've already referenced, intrinsic and extrinsic. So both forms, I want to stress this, can help you motivate yourself to be successful. Intrinsic motivation, again, is that which you learn because you're interested. It's its own reward. Think about ideas like a book that you might read for pure enjoyment, or maybe a problem that you enjoy unraveling in your mind, or an experiment that feeds your curiosity. You do those things because you want to do them. You pursue those interests because you're interested in them. You don't need anybody to tell you to get interested in them. Could be something as diverse as volleyball or basket weaving. That's so odd. The exact example came up in the text, and it's come up in every version of this type of class that I've ever seen. Just what is so intrinsically fascinating about basket weaving? I don't know, but apparently somebody's interested in it. But this is, of course, opposed to something, say, like in extrinsic motivation. Again, extrinsic motivation's fine. You receive an incentive for your work. And I think that on a very practical level, a lot of us are motivated by extrinsic stimuli. Many of you may have received money or a certain amount of cash for good grades that you earned each semester. I remember in my next door neighbor town where I live, the local video store would take report cards, and if you did very well, you would get a certain amount off of video games or movies that you wanted to rent. The local comic shop in DeKalb, just down the road from the college, they do the same thing. Every midterm and every end of the school year, you can bring your grades in and you can receive a certain amount off of comic books you wanted to buy and things like that. Extrinsic motivation could actually additionally take the form of things like extra credit to bolster a faltering grade or something like that. And then cars, or that's a bit extravagant, but maybe like a trip or something that you worked for. Whatever it is, it's an external source. You're not intrinsically motivated. You're motivated to get the reward that goes with it. And if you pick up some knowledge along the way, that's a great bonus. But the question is always asked, is one form of motivation better than the other? Sort of. I know that's not exactly the kind of answer that we like in today's society. We want a firm, resounding response one way or the other. But this is the best I can do. There is some evidence to suggest the more intrinsic your motivation is, the easier the learning process will be. But is that necessarily better? I'll leave that up to you to decide. One way to get yourself motivated, though, is to set learning goals. And I don't know about you, but when I read this in the chapter, I was like, oh boy, because I used to work in education, secondary and elementary education settings. And I used to always hear teachers and advisors and other people talk about remembering your learning goals and how important they are. And I have to be fair, I never really was asked to stop and consider or even write down what my learning goals were for a class. But hey, just because that wasn't my experience doesn't mean it's not a great tool. And this may be the technique that you need to help you become or stay motivated. Essentially, the authors, I was going to say they say, but I'll just say your authors, Nistel, Jellinek, and Holkuch, seem to suggest that grades as a motivator or as a learning goal. Like, I want to get straight A's, or I want to be on the AB honor roll. They say that that's a good aspiration, that's a good goal to set, but technically over time, evidence has suggested that grades themselves have not proven to be great long-term motivators. They suggest instead that you think about goals the same way you think about New Year's resolutions. You should be conscious of the goals that you establish, and you should strive to accomplish deliberate goals. And that means a couple of things. When you set goals, you should make sure they're realistic. And there are a couple of different types of goals: short-term, intermediate, and long-term goals. Short-term goals are part of a process that you can complete today, right now, within the next couple of hours. An intermediate goal is more geared to weeks to come, whereas a long-term goal could be anything from several months, even up to a year. And they give the really good example of going back to New Year's resolutions, losing weight. Right? A lot of people say that spontaneously during New Year's Eve celebration. I want to lose 10 pounds this year. Well, okay, your short-term goal then would be to develop a plan. How are you going to moderate your carbohydrate intake or your caloric intake? How are you going to design an exercise program? That could be done in a matter of hours or days. Pretty easy, just to determine what you're going to do. What are the steps you're going to take? That's a short-term goal. Your intermediate goal is finding ways to actualize those steps of the process. And then the long-term goal, which probably if you've got a goal of 10 pounds, you should realistically set that goal as being a month, 2 months, probably 2 to 3 months, or maybe even, a year is a bit extreme. I'd say set at least several months, because if you lose a pound a week, and there are about 4 weeks in an average month, you're going to need 2.5 to 3 months to do that. And it may be more difficult for some people than others. So a good long-term goal outline for losing 10 pounds would be over about a 3-month period. Maybe 2.5 if you're really committed to those goals. The other thing that you should think about when you're establishing a goal for academics or other purposes in life is to set a goal that's believable. If you say, I'm going to memorize the U.S. Constitution, that might not be a very believable goal, but you could certainly say that you could memorize the, 13 or all of the constitutional amendments, right? I think there are more than 13. There are several more, 26 or something like that. I think you should be able to memorize the 26 amendments to the U.S. Constitution within a reasonable amount of time. Okay? That's a believable goal. Goals should also be desirable. That means that you should actually want to do these things, not just do them because you can, but you should strive for goals that help you meet your own sense of criteria. Goals should also be measurable, meaning that you should be able to map your progress and see how close you are to realizing those goals or how much further you need to go. Lastly, and I'm not sure about this one because a lot of students today have anxiety and personal privacy issues that they've expressed more, and that's on the rise as a trend. So take this one with a grain of salt, folks. A lot of grains of salt in this particular example. But the authors of your text suggest that you should also make your goals public, meaning that you should let people know about your goals who will offer help if you falter or encouragement to complete your ideas because they respect and care about you. And it's true, making your goals public does create a certain amount of positive tension because it makes you more accountable to completing the goals that you want to accomplish. But once you establish some goals, how do you stay motivated to finish them or reach them? Well, you need to discover a couple of things, and I'll pause just for a moment to suggest that I think these are the most practical, most valuable tips and suggestions from Chapter 6. I've seen them many times over the course of this type of class and through many different colleges and many different texts, and they all suggest the same things. So I think they're worthy of our attention. First of all, one that's not listed here, get enough sleep, because a lot of times it's been noted through research that students really don't get enough sleep, and that partying or using a different time structure that's not as controlled or rigid as high school or secondary school, it can really mess up their circadian rhythms. So there's a wonderful little box here on page 60 in your text that suggests that if you miss too much sleep, you'll feel strange, and your motivation, your attitude, all of that will be off kilter. So try to make sure that your sleep, whenever you prefer to sleep and rest, is regimented. It doesn't mean you have to be an early bird. You have to stick to that ridiculous high school schedule of 8 a.m. Why high school starts at 7:45? I don't really understand, but actually I do know why that is, and the reason is because initially a lot of American thought and school design was geared to and influenced by creators of factory jobs. And a lot of what goes on, even to this day, in American schools, in terms of the scheduling and the socialization and the structured lunch times and bathroom breaks, that's all geared to make students useful workers. Not necessarily to intrinsically motivate them, but it's actually geared, a lot of the structure of school, to make you a more affable personality once you enter the workplace, whether that's as a skilled laborer or manufacturer or a supervisor or administrator. It's all designed to keep you in check as a good worker. So take that as you may. Not a wonderful truth to acknowledge, but it is necessarily true. Okay, so discover the times when you're best motivated. You may be, like I said, more of a day person, but you may also be a night owl, which is very similar to Mr. Fowler's schedule. I'm sort of naturally a night owl, which isn't necessarily good for me, because a lot of people in my life and a lot of people in my life are morning people. And my job, teaching, being a professor, that's a schedule that adheres or endears itself more to morning people. Whereas I am sort of a night owl, but not necessarily in the ways that would help me in my profession. Like I don't like to teach night classes. I like to unplug at night. That's why I'm a night owl. I like to be relaxed. So whenever you find yourself motivated, that's a time where you should kind of consistently strive to focus your efforts in working on a project, reading an assignment, completing your tasks for the day. When you do study difficult subjects first, because it's going to take more energy and more of your time and attention to focus on them, because you don't intrinsically like them. So study the things that are difficult or boring first. Also, try to plan breaks in your study sessions. In fact, the text and several texts suggest that you study for about an hour at a time, and that's pushing it. You may want to set your breaks a little bit more incrementally than that, but studying after an hour, it has been studied and proven that that first hour works, and that any time you extend to that study session after the hour will actually decrease or diminish your returns. So try to find time for about an hour to study. Now, COVID has actually made this next one relatively difficult, but if possible, either online or through other collaborative meetings, try to find a group that you can study with. That's a really good idea. Find the best study spot. Find the best study spot for you. It could be a quiet zone like a library. It could be your car. It could be a room or your basement. Wherever that is, find a good spot where you can concentrate. And this is kind of a weird one. Remember the best case and worst case scenarios. So use positive and negative imagery to imagine how successful you will be if you do the right things, and what consequences you might have to pay if you don't. Try to stay motivated. Lastly, and realistically, I think this is one of the best tips. Allow yourself time to refocus. Some goals may change over the course of an entire semester. And that may necessitate a change or a reimagining of what your goals are going to be for a class or for a particular issue in your life. And then reflect on the barriers to those goals. What is standing in your way? Because if you can identify what stands in your way and eliminate that, or get around that distraction in some way, shape, or form, the chances that you'll continue to stay motivated are that much better. Now, the rest of the chapter is divided up into conversations about attitudes and interests. Attitudes and interests are both situational, meaning that due to a whole host of factors that are influencing you, your attitudes and your interests, including things like location, time, experience, may change. Remember, if we start with interests, that every new class that you take will offer you new chances to develop different interests. And classes that may slowly take off, or start slowly rather, may take off later. And this is an interesting case. I have an example that I'll refer to you. I had a class similar to this one called College Success Strategies. It was called College Success Skills. And this class it was a big one, like 24 or 25 students in class. And I had one student who was not very motivated. His name was Robert, but he was going back to school after having worked in the automotive sector for like 40 years. So he was a non-traditional student. And he approached that class as something he had to take. And he wasn't thrilled with using that much time in a semester to take a class about that idea, about being successful in college, and he didn't really have a lot of interest in that course. But over the entirety of the semester, I was actually able to introduce him to new and different ideas, consider some alternate perspectives that he hadn't imagined before. And he said later that was one of the better classes he had. It's a little feather in my cap, I admit it. But that was one of the better classes he'd had that semester, because I had tried to reignite various students' interests in college and how they could handle a kind of different workload than they may have been used to. So it just goes to show, as an example, that you never can tell where you will be at the end of the semester reflecting back on a particular class. It may be a class that you disdain completely. Geez, I hope it's not this one. But let's assume that you might have a class, or you've already had a class that you didn't really like that much. Classes, again, that start slow might take off for you later, or even pay off later, years later sometimes, in ways that you perhaps cannot predict right this moment. So try to realize that your interests may shift a little bit. And also try to balance courses that you take in a given semester. Now, sometimes there are limits on your availability and your schedule, but you should try to balance a few courses every semester. And maybe if you take, a lot of students will take about 12 credits, I think, a semester, and maybe as many as 15. So if you took 15 credits, that would be there'd be 5 classes at 3 credits each. I think a more typical load is 12, which would be 3. So let's stick with the idea that 12 credits was the optimal amount. So at 3 each, you'd take 4 classes. So the balance is really easy there. You take 2 classes you really like and are interested in, maybe 2 classes offered in your major field of study, and then 2 required courses. And then you repeat that pattern the following semester until you've got what you need. If you've got a situation where you have to take 15 credits, which means you have to take 5 courses a semester, break it down to 3 and 5. 3 courses you really like and are interested in, and 2 that you may not be thrilled with, but that you know are required. Now, going back for a minute to think about attitudes. Attitudes are reflexive. So what that means is that your attitude reflects the way that you look at a particular class, a particular situation, or a particular life experience, and you then project that attitude every time you re-encounter that situation, that type of class, or that kind of experience, right? They have a good example in the text that I'm going to read from for a minute. Let's pretend for a moment that, for the sake of argument, you've got one professor who assigns 2 extra chapters that you need to read before you take a quiz on Friday. And you'd already had every minute of your schedule between this announcement and Friday planned. Well, it would be understandable that you might be irritated. But later, maybe a professor in another class cancels a test that was scheduled for Friday. And then now you suddenly have free time, right? The bottom line here is that most students' attitudes about things will and can change. So, don't hinge too much on an immediate reaction. Your attitude might mellow or change given a certain tweak of circumstances. Remember that attitudes can also be highly influential on your motivation. It makes sense that if you're not motivated in a particular course, that your level of interest and enthusiasm would drop, and that you might not be that fascinated, so you might not do that well. Well, the reverse could also be true, but you can't allow your attitude to focus on or conduct the way that your life is going to run from one moment to the next. That's just silly, right? Sometimes we just wake up grumpy because we didn't get enough sleep. And then your attitude's everything's going to be kind of crummy and bitter. Well, yeah, but you might miss something awesome along the way. So try to make sure that your motivation isn't unduly you know, unduly influencing your motivation. And remember that attitudes are also characteristic of your behavior, meaning that if you've got a bad attitude toward learning a foreign language like Mr. Fowler used to, and you believe that no matter what, you're probably only going to be average, you shouldn't be too surprised to find out that your grades are relatively average. You sort of self-fulfilled that prophecy because you allowed your attitude to be characteristic or to characterize your behavior. So that's not to say that you can always avoid that, but you should at least be aware of when that's happening. Now, to combat some of these things, some of these attitude-related issues, one thing that you can do is, of course, to think positive. And harnessing the power of a positive attitude is a great strategy to adopt as early as possible. Right? One of the things they suggest is that even though you are, harnessing this positive attitude, do prepare for the fact that things can and will change, and there will be conflicts between your expectations and your reality. Things like your class sizes or long lines at the bookstore are things that you really cannot control, so you shouldn't have a bad attitude about them. And right now, it's kind of, some of these examples don't exactly ring true, but like overly popular classes. I think all student involvement in college courses has taken a dip due to COVID. But you may be surprised to find out that when we return to regular life, there may be classes that close up because they're so popular, and you might not be able to get into them. And that's frustrating, but that's something that you're going to have to think about in relationship to your attitude. The same thing can be true of elements like roommates that you have to deal with, or being sick for, home. Now, at the junior college level, we don't really have to worry about homesickness because a lot of us are either living at home in our own apartments or living at home with mom and dad until we get ready to take that next step. Maybe you can think of them as your roommates in that regard. And you also have to take into account your attitude toward instructors. Like, I'm a pretty jovial and relaxed person. Most of you even suggested that I might be a little bit too lax for your particular sense of motivation, and I do appreciate that perspective. But each instructor is unique, right? And recognizing that fact may help you with your overall attitude about a course. You may have a zany instructor or somebody who ends class early or something like that. Whatever the case may be, you shouldn't allow yourself to feel intimidated by them. They tell an excellent story in the text about a student who made an appointment to meet with each of his instructors for about 15 minutes during the first week of college. That's a really good idea. And he said most of the time they were more than willing to meet with the student. And as much as you're comfortable, try to get to know your instructors. What are their interests? What's their background? What is their training? That is something that will only help you, I think, not only in college, but in life. If you extend the same metaphor to, supervisors at work or people that are going to employ you in a job interview, knowing a little bit about those people and where they're coming from will, in the long term, I think, serve you well. Finally, remember to have an open mind, right? Attitude and interest do seem to go hand in hand, as we've suggested already in this presentation, but they don't always have to. If you have an open mind, you might be able to flexibly think about each class and each individual subject that you approach in college. For example, if you really like math, chances are good that you'll have a better attitude toward the classes, which leads to a greater chance of success. But that doesn't mean you can't be a very successful student when it comes to your English or writing courses. Even if you don't traditionally enjoy or like a class, you should look for some new piece of knowledge or some kind of beneficial component that can help you through life. And I think if you assume that there's going to be something beneficial or positive out of each class experience, you'll often find that your attitude will lead you to that information rather than having to search through it actively. Lastly, and this is one that I think is very important, but that I really can't help you control too much, is that you need to consider your attitude toward yourself. And as this little image suggests, if you build your confidence and show your unique self, you're going to be able to embrace the way that your attitude might influence, either negatively or positively, the level of motivation you bring to a particular class or subject. Some of you, as it says here, may have been very successful students in high school. You may have been lucky with going to a good school or having really excellent instructors. Your early success may have motivated you to want to continue that level of success. That's great. Some of you may have been average students with indifferent teachers and busy parents who were detached from your learning process. But here's the good news. It doesn't matter. It does not matter which version you were before. College is a great time to expand your world and become the person, the type of learner that you always wanted to be, right? This is why they call it in so many movies and television programs and novels and everything else. This is the point in your life where you become who you actually want to be. This is where you get to abandon that idea of your personality that was foisted upon you by parents or society or school or your peers. None of that matters now. All that matters is that if you find intrinsic motivation to do what you want to do, you will ultimately be successful. So realistically, as we think about ways to maintain a positive attitude, ask yourself, what is it that you like about college? And concentrate on those feelings and try to induce as many scenarios as you can to focus on the best feelings about your college experience. Remember again, what you can and can't control. Also, don't dwell on past mistakes. Those are ways to learn as well. Acknowledge them as they come and incorporate ways to avoid them in the future. Try to give each course and each professor a chance. Now, I'm not going to suggest that everything's going to be great or that every instructor is going to treat you the way you really deserve to be treated as an individual, unique student. But try to give them the benefit of the doubt and try to give each course the benefit of the doubt too. And lastly, do expect to learn something of value in every course. Lastly, I've already reiterated this point, but I wanted to pause long enough just to bring it back up, okay? Because like I said, I do think it's important. But don't wait until the end of your college career to take all of the courses that you think you're going to hate. The reason that you should not do that is because ultimately students who have done this sort of thing have actually found that those courses are actually compelling or really interesting. So it's always a good idea to just give yourself enough time to consider what it is that you think will be of interest in each course. Okay, for next time, read chapter 7 of your text, College Success Strategies, entitled, Just What Do You Believe Anyway?, which can be found on pages 73 to 81. A little bit of a shorter chapter this week. And as I said, we will now think about or comment on the ideas for the weekly discussion question. So don't forget to work on your weekly discussion question this week. And if you want to read this, it's on page 71 and drips over onto the top of page 72. This is one of the real college scenarios that end each chapter. And this one's about Martin. Martin is a first-year student. Because he did very well in high school and also had high entrance exam scores, he has his pick of colleges. Martin's parents, who were very proud of their son's accomplishments, persuaded him to attend a large and prestigious school. Martin wanted to go to a smaller school that had a good reputation in the sciences because he had a strong interest in majoring in biology. In fact, although he had been successful in all of his courses in high school, he really didn't want much to do anything that wasn't in some way related to science. His career was to be a veterinarian. When he arrived on campus, he immediately felt overwhelmed. The campus was too big. He didn't know anyone, and his classes were extremely difficult. He had no choice in his courses for the first term because his schedule was set for him. He was enrolled in 5 courses: world literature, political science, calculus, anthropology, and computer applications. Martin became miserable quickly. For the first few days, he tried to maintain a positive attitude and stay motivated. But he kept asking himself, why am I here? Why did I let my parents talk me into this? Before he knew it, he found himself with a generally bad attitude about being in college and little to no motivation. He's very bright and has long-term career plans, but it's also quite obvious that he's not motivated to do the work and has a bad attitude about school. His classes are difficult, and combined, these two issues may influence him negatively if he doesn't do something fast. Now, based on what you have heard and what you know about the role of motivation, attitudes, interests, what advice would you give Martin? So like I said, I'll post this on the classroom discussion forum, and I'll be interested to hear what you have to say about this scenario. Okay, that's it for me, good old Mr. Fowler, today. I want to thank you so much for your time and your attention during today's session, and I bid you the best week that you can have. I'll talk to you some more on Wednesday. Take care.